May 8, 1943, Rome, Italy. Colonnello, Giuseppe Lanza, sat in his cramped office at the Servizio Informazioni Militare headquarters on Via Nazionale, reviewing the latest intelligence dispatches from the Far East Theater. A cigarette burned forgotten in the ashtray as his eyes scanned reports of Japanese advances in Burma and the fall of Singapore. "The Americans have lost their only land route to China," he muttered to his assistant, Capitano Marco Bellini. "Without the Burma Road, their nationalist allies are finished. It's just a matter of time." Lanza had spent 15 years in military intelligence, first tracking French activities in Tunisia, then British movements in the Mediterranean. His record was impeccable. He had successfully predicted the Allied invasion of North Africa, warned about the buildup in Malta, and even cracked several American diplomatic codes. But as he stubbed out his cigarette and reached for another file, he had no idea that 6,000 miles away, American transport pilots were accomplishing something that would never appear in his intelligence reports. Something so audacious, so technically impossible, by every military doctrine he knew, that even if someone had told him about it, he would have dismissed it as propaganda fantasy. The reality that Colonel Lanza couldn't fathom was this: American pilots were flying fully loaded cargo aircraft over the highest mountains on Earth, through weather that grounded even the most experienced aviators, carrying enough supplies to keep an entire nation in the war. They called it flying the Hump, and it was the largest sustained airlift operation in human history. What the Italians didn't know, what their entire intelligence apparatus had failed to detect, was that the Americans had decided to do the impossible. When the Japanese cut the Burma Road in March of 1942, instead of accepting that China would fall, the United States Army Air Forces simply started flying over the Himalayas. The dimensions of this oversight were staggering. While Italian intelligence officers in Rome meticulously catalogued every British convoy in the Mediterranean, while they decoded diplomatic cables and tracked troop movements across North Africa, American pilots were conducting up to 1,118 round-trip flights per day over mountain peaks that reached 18,000 feet, while Lanza and his colleagues focused on the Mare Nostrum strategy, believing the war would be won or lost in their familiar waters. The Americans were revolutionizing military logistics on a scale that would reshape modern warfare forever. Back in Rome, Capitano Bellini placed a new folder on Lanza's desk. "Sir, this just came from our attaché in Tokyo. The Japanese report increased air activity in the Assam region of India. They believe the British are staging reconnaissance missions." Lanza barely glanced at it. The British always fly reconnaissance. What else would they do with those obsolete Blenheims? He had no way of knowing that those reconnaissance missions were actually Douglas C-47 Skytrains, each carrying 5 tons of ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. He couldn't imagine that by July of 1945, these flights would deliver 71,042 tons in a single month. The concept was simply beyond the realm of possibility for a military mind trained in European warfare. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of SIM headquarters as Lanza reviewed the strategic map on his wall. Red pins marked Axis positions. Blue pins showed Allied forces. The Mediterranean was a dense cluster of markers. North Africa showed the recent defeats. But Asia was nearly blank, marked only with vague notations about Japanese advances and Chinese retreats. "Bellini," he said, pointing at the map. "What's the latest from the China-Burma-India theater?" "Very little, sir. Our resources are concentrated on the European front. The Japanese share minimal intelligence with us. They consider the Pacific their exclusive domain. And the Germans, they have no presence in that region either, sir. Their focus is entirely on the Eastern Front and the Atlantic." This was the fatal flaw in the Axis intelligence network. 3 powers allied by circumstance, but divided by geography and mutual distrust. The Italians watched the Mediterranean. The Germans focused on Europe and the Atlantic. The Japanese guarded their Asian secrets jealously. And in the vast gap between their spheres of attention, the Americans were performing an aeronautical miracle. Before we move on, please subscribe to help our channel get 1,000 subscribers. This is really important for us. Thanks in advance. Let's move on. What Lanza couldn't see from his Rome office was the scene unfolding every morning at Chabua Airfield in Assam, India. Picture this, a line of transport aircraft stretching nearly a mile down the runway, their engines already warming up in the pre-dawn darkness. The air thick with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel, and the deafening roar of dozens of Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines. Ground crews swarming around each aircraft, loading everything from .50 caliber ammunition to medical plasma to radio equipment. First Lieutenant James Morrison, a 23-year-old pilot from Ohio, walked around his C-46 Commando for the third time that morning, checking every rivet, every control surface. This would be his 47th flight over the hump, but he checked just as carefully as he had on his first. The Commando was a beast of an aircraft, 42 tons when fully loaded, powered by two Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines that each produced 2,000 horsepower. Morrison ran his hand along the cold aluminum fuselage, feeling the slight vibrations from the idling engines. "Lieutenant, we're loaded," called out Sergeant Davis, the loadmaster. 10,000 pounds of aviation fuel in jerry cans, plus 2,000 pounds of medical supplies. "We're at max gross weight," Morrison nodded. Maximum gross weight meant 45,000 pounds for takeoff. It meant the aircraft would struggle for every foot of altitude. It meant that if one engine failed anywhere between here and Kunming, they would have perhaps 60 seconds to find a place to crash land before the mountains claimed them. The statistics were brutal. For every 3 aircraft that completed the journey, one would eventually be lost. The route over the hump was already being called the Aluminum Trail, after the wreckage of hundreds of crashed planes that marked the way. But here's what made it possible. What Italian intelligence never understood: American industrial capacity wasn't just building aircraft, it was building them faster than they could be destroyed. The Douglas Aircraft Company factory in Long Beach, California, was producing one C-47 every 93 minutes. The Curtiss Wright factory in Buffalo was churning out C-46 Commandos at a similar rate. By 1945, American factories would have produced more than 300,000 military aircraft, more planes in 1 year than Italy had built in its entire history. Morrison climbed into the cockpit, his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Chen from California, already running through the pre-flight checklist. Oil pressure, green, fuel, topped off, all tanks, oxygen, checked and ready. Chen was Chinese-American, one of dozens of pilots of Chinese descent, flying the hump. He spoke both English and Mandarin fluently, which made him invaluable for coordinating with Chinese forces once they reached Kunming. "Jim," he said quietly, "did you hear about Harrison's crew?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "Yeah, flew into a mountain in the clouds. No survivors. That's the 3rd one this week." "I know." Morrison adjusted his seat, checked his parachute harness for the 10th time. "But we've got a job to do. China falls without these supplies. That means 1 million Japanese troops freed up to attack our positions in the Pacific, so we fly." Back in Rome, Colonel Lanza was having lunch with a German liaison officer, Oberstleutnant Klaus Weber. They sat in a small trattoria near the Colosseum, discussing the war over pasta and wine. "Your Italian campaign concerns us," Weber said, his Italian accented but fluent. "The Americans landed in Sicily. They will push north." "We're aware," Lanza replied, trying to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Our concern is their supply lines. If we can cut their logistics, they cannot advance." "Logistics, yes," Weber nodded. "This is the key. The Americans are good at production, but supply lines can be cut. Look at North Africa. Rommel nearly won by cutting British supply through the Mediterranean. Neither man mentioned China. Neither thought about Asia. For them, the war existed in a radius of perhaps 2,000 miles from Rome. The idea that the real logistics revolution was happening over the Himalayas never crossed their minds. They simply had no framework to understand it. At that exact moment, Lieutenant Morrison's C-46 lifted off from Chabua, the overloaded aircraft, using every inch of the 6,000-foot runway. The Commando clawed for altitude, the engines screaming at full power. Through the cockpit window, Morrison could see the beginning of the route. green valleys that quickly gave way to brown foothills. Then the first of the great peaks. The Patkai Range rose to 10,000 feet. Beyond that, the Kuman Range reached 14,000. And beyond that, the Sansung Range, where peaks touched 15,000 feet and higher. Climbing through 8,000, Chen called out, his eyes on the altimeter. "Oil temps rising. Watch the cylinder head temperatures," Morrison replied. "If they go into the red, we'll have to reduce power." But they couldn't reduce power. Not really. Not if they wanted to clear the mountains. This was the mathematics of death that defined the hump. You needed maximum power to climb. But maximum power overheated the engines. Reduce power, and you couldn't climb high enough. Keep maximum power, and the engines might fail. It was an equation with no good solution. Only pilots willing to push the limits every single day. The weather was clear today, which was a blessing. During monsoon season, which lasted from May through October, the route was a nightmare of thunderstorms that reached 50,000 feet, with downdrafts that could drop an aircraft 3,000 feet in seconds. Winds at altitude sometimes exceeded 125 miles per hour. Ice would form on the wings in minutes, adding tons of weight and destroying lift. And always, the mountains waiting below, ready to claim any pilot who lost focus for even a moment. Passing through 12,000, Chen announced, switching to oxygen. Both pilots adjusted their oxygen masks. At these altitudes, without supplemental oxygen, they would pass out in minutes. Morrison checked his oxygen flow gauge, making sure the system was working properly. They'd lost 2 aircraft last month when faulty oxygen systems caused the crews to become hypoxic and fly straight into mountainsides. In Rome, Lanza finished his lunch and returned to headquarters. A new intelligence summary waited on his desk, this one from a spy in Lisbon who reported on American shipping movements. "Significant increase in transport aircraft deliveries to India," the report stated. "Purpose unknown. Possibly for operations in Burma. Possibly for operations in Burma." How wrong they were. Morrison and thousands like him weren't supporting operations in Burma. They were keeping an entire nation supplied, an entire theater of war alive. Every day, aircraft like his carried fuel for the fighters, defending Chongqing, ammunition for the armies holding the line against Japan, medicine for the millions of wounded, and food for the starving. The hump wasn't supporting Burma operations. The hump was rewriting the rules of warfare itself. 15,000 feet, Chen said. "We're at the high point. Kunming is 300 miles ahead. All downhill from here." Morrison allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They were over the worst of it, but he knew the return trip would be just as dangerous, and tomorrow they'd do it all again. And the next day, and the next. Until the war ended, or the mountains claimed them. What neither Morrison nor Lanza knew was that this operation would change military logistics forever. The techniques developed over the hump, the organizational systems, the maintenance procedures, the weather forecasting methods, all of it would be studied and refined. In just 3 years, those lessons would be applied to the Berlin airlift, where the Americans would supply an entire city by air. The hump was the laboratory where modern strategic airlift was invented. As Morrison's C-46 began its descent toward Kunming, passing over the last of the great peaks, Colonel Lanza in Rome was filing away the intelligence report about increased air activity in India. He marked it as low priority. After all, what could a few transport aircraft possibly accomplish over mountains that high? It was impossible to supply an entire nation by air. Everyone knew that. Everyone, except the Americans who were doing it. The story of how America came to fly the most dangerous air route in history began not in the Himalayas, but in the drawing rooms of Washington, D.C., and the factories of Middle America. To understand the magnitude of what Italian intelligence missed, you have to understand what American engineers had been quietly building while Europe tore itself apart. In 1935, when Douglas aircraft engineer Arthur Raymond sat down to design a new transport plane, he had a simple goal: create an aircraft that could carry passengers in comfort and cargo in quantity. The result was the Douglas Commercial III, the DC-3. By 1941, when America entered the war, Douglas had delivered over 450 civilian DC-3s, but Raymond and his team had also created the military version, the C-47 Skytrain. Nobody at the time, not even Raymond himself, could have imagined that this plane would become the workhorse of an impossible airlift. The C-47 was a marvel of practical engineering. It had a wingspan of 95 feet, was powered by two Pratt and Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines, producing 1,200 horsepower each, and could carry up to 6,000 pounds of cargo or 28 fully equipped paratroopers. But more importantly, it was simple. A good mechanic could fix almost anything that went wrong with basic tools. A pilot with moderate skills could fly it safely, and American factories could build them faster than anyone thought possible. Douglas Aircraft's factory in Long Beach, California, operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The assembly line was a masterpiece of industrial efficiency. Raw aluminum sheets entered at one end. 93 minutes later, a completed aircraft rolled out the other end. Workers, many of them women who had never seen the inside of a factory before the war, learned to rivet, wire, and assemble with precision that would have impressed any craftsman. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. She was real, and she was building the aircraft that would keep China in the war. But the C-47 had a limitation. It could only carry 6,000 pounds. When the Burma Road closed and planners realized they needed to supply an entire nation by air, they needed something bigger. Enter the Curtiss C-46 Commando. The Commando was a beast, 42 tons at maximum takeoff weight, two Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines, each producing 2,000 horsepower. It could carry 10,000 pounds of cargo, nearly double the C-47's capacity. But it was also temperamental. The engines overheated constantly. The electrical system was prone to failures. Early models had a horrifying tendency to catch fire in flight, earning it the nickname Flying Coffin among pilots. Captain Thomas Hardin, the chief maintenance officer at Chabua Air Base, knew every flaw in the C-46 intimately. He had 50 aircraft under his care, and on any given day, 15 of them would be grounded with mechanical issues. The Commando is like a thoroughbred racehorse, he once wrote to his wife in Kansas. Incredibly powerful, capable of amazing things, but it requires constant attention. Miss one maintenance check, overlook one warning sign, and it'll kill you. Hardin implemented a system that would later become standard across military aviation: phase maintenance. Instead of waiting for something to break, his crews performed preventive maintenance on a strict schedule. Every 10 hours of flight time, basic checks. Every 50 hours, detailed inspections. Every 200 hours, complete engine overhauls. It was labor-intensive and required a massive supply chain of spare parts, but it worked. Under Hardin's system, the accident rate at Chabua dropped by 40% in 6 months. But maintenance was only part of the challenge. The real problem was weather forecasting. Flying the hump without accurate weather information was suicide. The monsoon season brought thunderstorms that reached 50,000 feet, far higher than any transport aircraft could fly. Inside those storms, updrafts and downdrafts exceeded 6,000 feet per minute. An aircraft caught in the wrong part of a storm could be torn apart by sheer force. Major Edward Williams, a meteorologist from the University of Chicago, arrived in Assam in October of 1942 with a revolutionary idea: create a weather forecasting network specifically for the hump route. He established weather stations at key points along the route, each equipped with radio equipment to transmit observations. Every 6 hours, his team compiled data on temperature, wind speed, cloud cover, and barometric pressure. From this information, Williams created forecasts that predicted safe flying windows with remarkable accuracy. The key, Williams explained to a group of pilots, is understanding that Himalayan weather has patterns. The monsoon comes from the southwest. The jet stream blows from west to east. Where these systems meet, you get catastrophic turbulence. But between the systems, there are corridors of relatively calm air. Find those corridors, and you can fly safely even in bad weather. Williams' forecasting system wasn't perfect. Pilots, still flew into storms. Aircraft still crashed due to unexpected weather, but his work reduced weather-related accidents by an estimated 30%. More importantly, it gave pilots the confidence to fly when older doctrines would have grounded the entire fleet. In modern terms, Williams and his team invented tactical weather forecasting for aviation. Meanwhile, in Rome, Colonnello Lanza's intelligence service remained focused on the Mediterranean. In June of 1943, he received a detailed report about Allied preparations for the invasion of Sicily. The report was accurate, well-researched, and helped Italian forces prepare their defenses. Lanza was praised by his superiors. He was doing his job brilliantly, within the context of what his job was understood to be. What nobody in the sim realized was that while they were watching the Allies prepare to invade Sicily, the Americans were flying an average of 213 round trips per day over the Himalayas. In June of 1943 alone, American and British transport crews delivered 11,970 tons of supplies to China. That's more cargo than was moved through the port of Naples in the same month. An entire port's worth of supplies moved by air over the highest mountains on Earth, and Italian intelligence had no idea it was happening. The organizational structure that made the hump possible was itself a revolution in military logistics. In August of 1944, Brigadier General William H. Tunner took command of the India-China Division of the Air Transport Command. Tunner was an organizational genius who understood that the key to the airlift wasn't just aircraft or pilots, but systems. Tunner's first observation was simple but profound. The hump operation was being run like a collection of individual missions when it should be run like a railroad. Trains don't operate randomly. They run on schedules. They follow procedures. They have standardized loading and unloading protocols. Tunner decided to apply railroad thinking to aviation. He implemented what he called the production line approach. Aircraft didn't land and then wait for instructions. They followed a precise schedule. When a C-47 landed at Kunming, a ground crew was already waiting. The pilot didn't shut down the engines. The cargo was unloaded through the left cargo door, while new cargo was loaded through the right door. The entire process took exactly 12 minutes. Then the aircraft taxied back to the runway and took off. No wasted time, no confusion. Just smooth, efficient operation. Tunner also revolutionized the approach pattern. Previously, when weather closed in at Kunming, aircraft would circle, waiting for clearance to land. This was dangerous and wasted fuel. Tunner instituted a new rule. If you couldn't land on your first approach, you didn't circle. You flew back to India and tried again later. This single change reduced mid-air collisions dramatically. The results were staggering. In December of 1944, before Tunner's reforms, the hump operation delivered 34,495 tons. In July of 1945, after Tunner's systems were fully implemented, they delivered 71,042 tons. Tunner had more than doubled the capacity of the operation without adding a single additional aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel James Davies, a British liaison officer who observed Tunner's operation, wrote in his diary, "The Americans have done something I wouldn't have believed possible. They've turned chaos into clockwork. Every aircraft, every crew, every ground team knows exactly what to do and when to do it. It's not brilliant piloting that makes the hump work, though the pilots are certainly brave. It's brilliant organization." But while Tunner was revolutionizing military logistics in Asia, Axis intelligence remained blind to the operation. In Berlin, Abwehr analysts focused on Atlantic convoy routes and partisan movements in occupied Europe. In Tokyo, Japanese intelligence tracked American submarine activities and fleet movements in the Pacific. In Rome, SIM continued its Mediterranean focus, tracking Allied preparations for the Italian campaign. The intelligence failure wasn't due to incompetence. It was structural. The Axis powers had divided the world into spheres of influence, and each power jealously guarded information within its sphere. The Japanese considered China their exclusive concern and shared minimal intelligence with their European allies. The Germans were preoccupied with the Eastern Front, and the threat of a second front in Western Europe. The Italians, surrounded by Allied threats in the Mediterranean, couldn't afford to allocate resources to monitoring distant Asian operations. There was another factor: disbelief. Even when scraps of information about the hump reached Axis intelligence agencies, they were dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. The idea of supplying a nation by air was simply too far-fetched. Traditional military thinking held that strategic supply required either land routes or sea routes. Air transport was fine for small-scale tactical operations, moving ammunition to a forward base or evacuating wounded, but supplying an entire nation, impossible. A captured German intelligence report from October 1944, discovered after the war, mentioned increased Allied air activity over Burma and Yunnan province. The report speculated that the Allies were possibly establishing forward air bases for operations against Japanese positions. The analyst who wrote the report never considered that the air activity represented a fundamental change in how wars could be fought and supplied. In contrast, American planners had understood from the beginning that the hump was more than just a supply line. It was a strategic weapon. Every ton of supplies delivered to China meant that Chinese forces could continue fighting Japan. Every month that China stayed in the war meant that hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops remained tied down on the Asian mainland, unable to reinforce positions in the Pacific, where American forces were advancing island by island toward Japan. President Franklin Roosevelt himself had recognized the strategic importance of China. In February of 1942, just weeks after the fall of Singapore, Roosevelt sent a memo to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. The Burma Road must be kept open at all costs. If land routes are cut, we must find another way. China must stay in the war. That memo led directly to the creation of the hump route. But Roosevelt and Marshall weren't just thinking tactically. They were thinking about the post-war world. The China that survived the war as an American ally would be a powerful counterweight to Soviet influence in Asia. The hump wasn't just about defeating Japan. It was about shaping the peace that would follow. This geopolitical chess game was completely invisible to Axis intelligence, which remained focused on the immediate military situation. The first time Japanese intelligence officers realized something extraordinary was happening over the Himalayas came not from observation, but from mathematics. In March of 1943, analysts in Tokyo noticed a puzzling discrepancy. Chinese forces in Yunnan province were consuming ammunition at rates that should have exhausted their supplies months ago. Yet the Chinese kept fighting, kept firing, kept holding the line against Japanese advances. Major Takeshi Yamamoto, an intelligence officer stationed in occupied Burma, was ordered to investigate. He established observation posts along the approaches to Yunnan and waited. What he saw changed his understanding of what was possible in modern warfare. Every 30 minutes, he wrote in his report to Tokyo, we observe American transport aircraft crossing the mountains toward Kunming. The volume of traffic suggests they are moving significant quantities of supplies. We estimate 50 to 70 flights per day. Yamamoto's estimate was conservative. By March of 1943, the hump operation was running 125 flights per day on average. But even Yamamoto's underestimate should have alarmed Axis planners. It didn't. When his report reached Berlin and Rome through Japanese diplomatic channels, it was filed away with minimal comment. The prevailing attitude was summed up by a German analyst's marginal note on the report. Tactical resupply only. No strategic significance. This dismissal would prove to be one of the greatest intelligence failures of the war. While Axis analysts focused on counting tanks and tracking troop movements, the Americans were rewriting the fundamental rules of logistics. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the transformation of operational procedures under General Tunner's command. Tunner arrived in India in September of 1944 and immediately saw chaos. Aircraft landed whenever they arrived. Crews wandered off looking for food or rest, while their planes sat idle. Cargo was loaded haphazardly. Maintenance was reactive rather than preventive. It was, Tunner later wrote, like watching a railroad where every train operated independently, with no timetables, no coordination, no system. His first reform was brutally simple: standardization. Every C-47 would carry exactly 5,000 pounds on the westbound leg to China. Every C-46 would carry exactly 10,000 pounds. No exceptions, no special cases. The loads were pre-packaged at supply depots in India, ready to be loaded in minutes. This alone increased efficiency by 20%. But Tunner's real genius was in understanding human factors. He recognized that pilots were pushing themselves beyond safe limits, flying exhausted, making fatal mistakes. The statistics were grim. In the first months of operation, the accident rate was 1 aircraft lost for every 218 flights. Most crashes weren't due to weather or mechanical failure. They were due to human error by exhausted crews. Tunner implemented mandatory rest periods. Crews flew a maximum of 6 round trips per week, with at least 1 full day off. He established rest facilities at both ends of the route, with hot food, clean beds, and even recreation areas. A rested pilot, Tunner observed, is worth 3 exhausted heroes. The results were measurable. By January of 1945, under Tunner's system, the accident rate had dropped to 1 per every 728 flights. Not because the weather improved or the aircraft became more reliable, but because the system treated pilots as humans rather than machines. Captain Robert Lee, a C-47 pilot from Texas, experienced the transformation firsthand. Before Tunner, he recalled in a post-war interview, "We'd land at Kunming exhausted, wait around for hours while cargo was unloaded, maybe sleep on a cot somewhere, then fly back whenever they told us to." Under Tunner, we'd land, the cargo was off in 10 minutes, we'd get a hot meal, sleep in a real bed, and fly back on a schedule we knew days in advance. It sounds simple, but it saved lives. The transformation wasn't just operational, it was cultural. The early Hump pilots had seen themselves as cowboys, independent operators, who succeeded through individual skill and courage. Tunner transformed them into professionals who succeeded through discipline and adherence to procedures. Some pilots resented this change, seeing it as a loss of autonomy. But they couldn't argue with the results. More supplies delivered, fewer aircraft lost, fewer friends buried. Meanwhile, the strategic impact was becoming impossible to ignore, at least for those paying attention. In April of 1944, Chinese forces stopped a major Japanese offensive in Henan province. Japanese commanders were stunned. They had calculated that Chinese ammunition stocks should have been exhausted weeks earlier. Where were the Chinese getting supplies? The answer was obvious to anyone looking at the sky. Every day, hundreds of American transport aircraft roared overhead, clearly visible to Japanese positions, but the implications of what they were seeing didn't register. Traditional military doctrine said that air transport was for small-scale tactical operations. The idea that an entire army could be supplied by air simply didn't compute. Lieutenant General Shizuichi Tanaka, commanding Japanese forces in central China, sent increasingly frustrated reports to Tokyo. Enemy forces continue to resist despite our interdiction of ground supply routes. Aerial resupply appears more extensive than initially assessed. Request fighter aircraft to target transport planes. Tokyo's response was tepid. Fighter aircraft were needed elsewhere. The transport planes, while numerous, didn't seem like a strategic threat. This was the fatal flaw in Japanese thinking, and by extension, in all Axis strategic analysis. They could see what was happening, but couldn't comprehend its significance. They were watching a revolution in warfare, but interpreting it through the lens of past conflicts. It was like a medieval knight watching a cannon demonstration and concluding it was just a noisy catapult. Back in Rome, Colonnello Lanza received his first detailed report about the Hump operation in May of 1944. The report came from a neutral Swiss journalist who had visited Kunming and observed the American supply operation. "The Americans are flying supply missions over the Himalayas," the report stated. "I personally observed 43 transport aircraft land in a single day. Local sources claim this continues daily." Lanza read the report with interest, but drew the wrong conclusion. He calculated that 43 flights per day, assuming each aircraft carried 5,000 pounds, meant 215,000 pounds of supplies daily. Converted to metric tons, that was 97 tons per day. Respectable for an airlift, but hardly strategic. His marginal note on the report read, "Limited tactical resupply operation. Confirms Japanese reports. No major strategic implications." What Lanza didn't know was that by May of 1944, the Hump operation was actually running 278 flights per day on average, and many of those flights were C-46s carrying 10,000 pounds, not C-47s with 5,000. The actual daily tonnage wasn't 97 tons, it was over 1,000 tons. Lanza's intelligence was outdated before it reached his desk, and his analysis was built on faulty assumptions. But even if Lanza had known the correct figures, would he have understood their significance? The answer is probably not. Understanding the Hump required understanding American industrial capacity, and that was something Axis intelligence consistently failed to grasp. Consider the mathematics. By 1944, American factories were producing 16,000 combat aircraft per year. That's 44 aircraft every single day. For every plane lost over the Hump, American factories were building 20 more. For every pilot killed, American training programs were graduating 50 replacements. The Hump could sustain losses that would have crippled any other nation's air force, and barely notice the impact. Sergeant Paul Henderson, a maintenance supervisor at Jorhat Airfield in Assam, watched this industrial might in action. "We'd lose a plane on Monday," he later recalled, "and by Friday, a replacement would arrive, fresh from the factory in California. It still had that new plane smell." The serial numbers just kept going up. After a while you realized, they can build them faster than we can break them. That's when I knew we were going to win. This industrial reality was completely alien to Axis military thinking. German, Italian and Japanese factories struggled to replace losses. Every aircraft shot down was a strategic blow. Every experienced pilot killed was irreplaceable. They couldn't conceive of an enemy for whom losses were merely accounting entries, irritations rather than catastrophes. The transformation reached its peak in July of 1945. By this point, Tunner's systems had been refined to perfection. The operation ran like clockwork. Weather forecasting had improved, to the point where safe flying windows could be predicted with 90% accuracy. Maintenance procedures had reduced mechanical failures by 60%. Pilot training had standardized procedures to the point where any crew could fly any aircraft on any route with equal efficiency. The numbers for that month tell the story. 650 aircraft in operation. 1,118 round trips per day on peak days. 71,042 tons delivered. That's more cargo than the entire Italian merchant marine carried in any month during 1943. An entire nation's cargo capacity, moved by air, over the highest mountains on Earth, in a single month. And still, Axis intelligence didn't grasp the implications. A German intelligence summary from August 1945, one of the last produced before the war ended, mentioned the Hump in passing. Allied air supply route over Burma continues operations. Capacity estimated at 400 to 500 tons daily. The actual capacity was over 2,000 tons daily. Even at the end of the war, German intelligence underestimated the Hump's capacity by 75%. Why? How could intelligence services that successfully cracked Allied codes, that predicted invasion sites, that tracked convoy movements across oceans, fail so completely to understand the Hump? The answer lies in something deeper than mere information gathering. It lies in paradigms, in the mental models through which we interpret information. Axis intelligence operated within a paradigm where logistics meant railways and ships, where supply lines could be cut by bombing ports or destroying bridges, where strategic supply required controlling territory. The Americans had stepped outside that paradigm. They had created a supply line that existed entirely in the air, that couldn't be cut by conventional means, that required no territorial control except for the departure and arrival points. General Albert Wedemeyer, who commanded American forces in China, understood this perfectly. In a lecture given after the war, he explained, "The hump wasn't just a supply line, it was a demonstration of a new principle, mobility through the third dimension. We didn't need to control Burma to supply China. We didn't need to control the seas or secure the roads. We just needed to control the air. And American industrial capacity ensured we had more aircraft than could ever be shot down." This principle would shape post-war American military doctrine. The ability to project power through airlift, to supply forces without vulnerable ground supply lines, became a cornerstone of American strategy. From the Berlin airlift to Kosovo to Afghanistan, American military operations would rely on the lessons learned over the hump. But in 1944 and 45, as the transformation reached its peak, Axis intelligence watched it happen and never understood what they were seeing. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war in the Pacific was over. In Rome, Colonnello Giuseppe Lanza sat in his office, now occupied by Allied forces, reviewing documents as part of his debriefing. An American intelligence officer, Major Richard Chen, placed a thick folder on the desk. "Colonel, we'd like to ask you about the Hump operation." Lanza looked up, confused. "The what operation?" "The airlift over the Himalayas, the China supply route. Surely your service tracked it." Lanza opened the folder. Inside were dozens of photographs. American transport aircraft in formation over mountain peaks, massive supply depots in India, cargo being loaded onto aircraft at dozens of airfields. Statistical charts showed the tonnage delivered month by month, climbing from a few thousand tons in 1942 to over 71,000 tons by July 1945. The total, 650,000 tons of supplies delivered over 3 years. Lanza felt his blood run cold. "We had reports of increased air activity in Burma," he said quietly. "We assessed it as tactical resupply, limited scale." Major Chen nodded. "You weren't alone. German intelligence estimated the capacity at 400 tons per day. The Japanese thought it was perhaps 600 tons. The actual average by 1945 was over 2,000 tons per day." 2,000 tons, Lanza repeated, his voice hollow. "That's impossible. No air force could sustain that over the Himalayas." "And yet we did," Chen replied. "For 3 years, your intelligence services were watching the Mediterranean, while we were rewriting the rules of warfare in Asia. Tell me, Colonel, why didn't you see it?" Lanza had no answer. "How do you explain to a victor that their victory was built on concepts your entire worldview couldn't accommodate? How do you say that you failed not because you weren't looking, but because you were looking for the wrong things in the wrong ways?" The human cost of the hump was staggering. 1,314 pilots and crew members died on the route. 594 aircraft were lost, their wreckage still marking the aluminum trail across the Himalayas. At its peak, the operation employed over 34,000 personnel across dozens of bases in India, Burma, and China. The financial cost exceeded $800 million, equivalent to over $14 billion today. But the strategic return on that investment was incalculable. China stayed in the war, tying down over 1 million Japanese troops who could not be deployed to defend the Pacific Islands against American advances. The techniques developed over the hump became the foundation for post-war strategic airlift. The organizational systems created by Tunner were directly applied to the Berlin airlift, where American and British aircraft supplied 2.5 million people for 11 months, delivering 1.7 million tons of supplies, more than double what the hump delivered in its entire operational life. Captain Robert Lee, who flew 137 missions over the hump, attended a reunion of hump pilots in 1968. By then, he was a retired colonel, and many of his fellow veterans were successful businessmen, engineers, and executives. "We knew we were doing something important," he told a journalist at the reunion, "but we didn't know we were changing warfare forever. We thought we were just trying to keep China in the fight. Turned out we were inventing the future." The technical innovations from the hump were equally significant. The weather forecasting methods developed by Major Williams became standard practice in military and civilian aviation. The maintenance procedures implemented by Captain Hardin are still taught in aviation schools today. The radio navigation systems tested over the hump evolved into the navigation aids that guide aircraft worldwide. But perhaps the most important legacy was conceptual. Before the hump, military doctrine held that strategic supply required either control of territory or control of sea lanes. After the hump, American planners understood that control of the air could substitute for both. This insight shaped the development of strategic airlift aircraft like the C-130 Hercules, the C-5 Galaxy, and the C-17 Globemaster. It influenced American decisions to maintain a massive airlift capacity even during peacetime. And it enabled American military operations in regions where traditional supply lines were impossible or impractical. The Berlin crisis of 1948 provided the first test of whether the hump's lessons could be applied elsewhere. When the Soviet Union blocked all ground routes into West Berlin, many analysts predicted the city would have to be abandoned. But General William Tunner, fresh from his success over the hump, was called to organize the Berlin Airlift. He applied exactly the same principles: standardization, systematic procedures, preventive maintenance, and treating the airlift as a railroad in the sky. The results vindicated everything the hump had proven. At its peak, the Berlin Airlift delivered nearly 13,000 tons per day, far exceeding what anyone thought possible. The operation lasted 11 months, supplied 2.5 million people, and proved conclusively that a modern city could be sustained entirely by air. Without the hump, without the lessons learned over the Himalayas, the Berlin Airlift would have been impossible. And without the Berlin Airlift, West Berlin might have fallen to Soviet control, potentially changing the entire trajectory of the Cold War. In the decades that followed, American military operations repeatedly demonstrated the value of strategic airlift. During the Vietnam War, C-130 aircraft flew supply missions that would have been impossible without the organizational lessons from the hump. In the Gulf War of 1991, the massive buildup of forces in Saudi Arabia relied on airlift capacity that directly descended from hump-era innovations. In Afghanistan and Iraq, forward operating bases were supplied almost entirely by air, exactly as China had been supplied 50 years earlier. The humanitarian applications were equally significant. When disasters strike, American military airlift is often the first response. The earthquake relief operations in Haiti, the tsunami response in Indonesia, the famine relief in Somalia, all relied on strategic airlift capabilities that trace their lineage directly to the hump. The C-130 Hercules, perhaps the most successful military transport aircraft ever built, was designed with hump lessons explicitly in mind: rugged construction, ability to operate from primitive airfields, and the capacity to carry heavy loads in difficult conditions. But what of the intelligence failure? What can we learn from the fact that three major intelligence services completely missed one of the most significant military operations of the war? The lesson isn't about intelligence gathering. Axis intelligence agencies had information about the hump. They received reports, captured documents, interviewed prisoners. The problem was interpretation. They saw the facts, but couldn't understand them because the facts didn't fit their conceptual framework. This is a danger that persists in intelligence analysis today. We're all prone to paradigm blindness, to seeing only what our mental models allow us to see. The Axis intelligence failure over the hump wasn't due to lack of data, it was due to lack of imagination. They couldn't imagine a supply line that existed entirely in the air because their entire understanding of logistics was built on land and sea. In a sense, the Axis powers lost the hump battle before it even began, not because they lacked the technology or the pilots to create their own airlift, though that was certainly true, but because they lacked the conceptual framework to recognize that such a thing was possible or necessary. They were fighting a 20th century war with a 19th century understanding of logistics. Lieutenant Colonel James Davies, the British liaison officer who observed Tunner's operation, perhaps said it best in his post-war memoir: "The Germans built the finest tanks, The Japanese trained the most dedicated pilots, the Italians designed elegant aircraft, but the Americans built a system, and systems, in the end, beat individual excellence every time. The hump wasn't won by the best pilots or the best aircraft. It was won by the best procedures, the best maintenance, the best organization, and that's a lesson the Axis powers never learned. Today, the hump is largely forgotten, except by aviation historians and veterans associations. The names of the men who flew it are fading from memory. The airfields in Assam are mostly gone, reclaimed by jungle. The bases in Kunming are now part of a modern Chinese city. Even the aluminum trail is gradually disappearing as the mountains reclaim the wreckage. But the legacy lives on. Every time a C-130 delivers humanitarian supplies to a disaster zone, that's the hump. Every time the Air Force airlifts troops to a combat zone, that's the hump. Every time weather forecasters use systematic data collection to predict flying conditions, that's the hump. Every time maintenance crews perform preventive maintenance on a schedule rather than waiting for something to break, that's the hump. If you've watched this far, you must have liked the video. Please write which city you're watching from in the comments, and if you still don't like it, leave a like. See you in the next video. The Hump operation demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Imagination matters as much as firepower. Organization matters as much as courage, and the ability to think beyond conventional paradigms can be more valuable than any weapon system. Colonel Lanza and his colleagues in Axis intelligence weren't stupid or incompetent. They were intelligent, dedicated professionals doing their jobs well within the framework they understood. Their failure was a failure of imagination, a failure to conceive that the rules of warfare could be rewritten, and that failure, more than any single battle or campaign, explains why the Axis lost the war. They were fighting the last war, while the Americans were inventing the next one. Over the Himalayas, where the ghosts of 1,314 airmen still fly their eternal missions, the hump remains a testament to what's possible when you refuse to accept what's impossible. When Italian forces failed to anticipate the American airlift over the Himalayan mountains, they weren't just missing an intelligence report, they were missing the future.